Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So something I've never really spoken about very much in my channel, in all the videos I've done, is the Arabic or Persian Shamshir. One of the reasons I've never spoken much about these is I didn't have one before, but I recently acquired one. So as you can see, it's got a very distinctive blade shape, and I'll talk about that in a second, and that's really what this video is primarily about. It has a grip made of elephant ivory and a guard made of iron. Just very briefly to look at the hilt. So one of the characteristics, this is sometimes known in European sword book sources as a Mamluk style hilt. So this very characteristic cross guard that you'll see is like a cross, that always has these, or pretty much always has these languettes which go up and down. The downwards ones go into the grip, the upwards ones kind of secure around the scabbard. So it forms this very characteristic cross, and we can see that type of guard going all the way back into the medieval period, and we can find it on many different types of sword, including straight Saif type swords, Saif, and also on certain Indian swords. We see this sort of carrying, in fact this is an Indian sword, but I'll talk about that in a second, going over into Indian swords, even influencing the style of the Tulwar and other Indian cross guards on their hilts. And indeed we find it, in a way, we kind of find something similar on the Sudanese Kaskara with this cross shape. And one thing to note is that sometimes these lower languettes which go into the grip are covered with a material, but they are nevertheless there. So if we look at a Sudanese Kaskara, for example, those are often covered by the leather or crocodile skin grip covering, but they are nevertheless there, and they help secure the guard into the grip and make the whole hilt construction more solid and tight and less prone to moving around. Equally, on some Arabic swords you find a wire binding around this section which covers up those languettes, but again I assure you they are there underneath the wire, and they help make the hilt construction more solid. But what I really want to point out in this video, I'm sure I do other videos about this sword. Before I just go on, some of you will be wondering, is it Wootz? Is it Wootz? I don't actually know, but there's a chance that it's Wootz. You'll notice the blade is very dark with patina. I need to do quite a bit of work on this blade. So I did do a test etch on this side of the blade, which you won't be able to see because it's all quite dark again, even after the etching I've done. And that didn't really give me any sure idea. It could be fine Wootz, maybe. It's difficult to tell. Anyway, I'm assuming, because I'm always on the hunt for Wootz, as you know, so I'm assuming that it's not Wootz for now, but it might be. But I need to do some proper work on this blade, probably now once I've moved house. For anyone who doesn't know, the reason it's very echoey in here is because most of the stuff is now gone and packed into boxes and storage, because we'll be moving, so goodbye this particular backdrop relatively imminently now. But what I really want to say in this video is to point out something about these Arabic or Persian style blades and the shape of the blades, and they're very particular. Now, it's not to say there isn't variation. There are different versions, but this one I consider relatively typical of the type. And we do find this type of blade exported to other areas of the world, most notably India. And we do find this type of blade mounted into native Indian Tulwar hilts, and indeed sometimes onto the so-called Mamluk or Arabic Persian style hilt. This, I believe, this example, this sword, I believe is actually an Indian Shamshir rather than a Middle Eastern Shamshir, but I'm not 100% certain about that, but I believe it's Indian. Anyway, the blade shape. So, something that a lot of people get wrong when they represent, whether it's in art or, you know, fantasy, sort of fantasy art, or whether it's in historical art, or whether it's in kind of Arab-inspired stuff in movies and things like this, is that they get the shape of the Shamshir blade wrong. Now, that's not to say that this blade shape necessarily would be right for the medieval period. It's not. In fact, most Arabic swords and a lot of Persian swords in what we would call the medieval period were actually straight. They weren't yet curved. But this type of blade really comes in about the 16th century for various reasons that I might look into in another video. But this type of blade comes in the 16th century and is really most the most common examples found are actually from the 18th and 19th centuries. Similarly, the classic style of Turkish kiliç that people are familiar with, actually I think a lot of people think of that classic design as being older than it is. Actually, most of those date to the 18th and 19th century. There are older styles of kiliç, but they don't look quite the same in general. But back to the Shamshir. One thing that you really have to note about the Shamshir blade is you'll notice it is quite slender. It's about as broad as a European military saber, and it's about as broad as a katana. Okay, so they're not particularly broad blades. That's the first thing to note. The second thing is, yes, they are very curved, but you'll notice the curve is almost entirely in the second half of the blade. So one thing that replicas and TV and film gets wrong is they have the curve being continuous throughout the blade, and this is wrong. Actually, it's a bit like the limb of a bow, if you think about it. The center section is relatively straight. There might be a very slight curve to it, but basically the sword blade is almost entirely straight until about the best part of halfway up the blade, and the curve is about roughly from the base to the point is roughly 45 degrees, is all in the second half of the blade. Now, of course, the reason for that is because you're striking with the second half of the blade. So when you're cutting, you're meeting the target at 45 degrees, which increases the slicing effect, which on some targets makes it cut more effectively, or slice for a longer amount of the edge, create a longer wound. And also, arguably, it enables you, particularly when the sword's being used from horseback, but also on foot as well, to draw the blade through and free it up. So when you cut into the target, it passes through and can immediately pass up for a follow-up cut. The straighter blade, you have to artificially do that more with the wrist to create the draw. So essentially, it gives you a drawing cut. It gives you the so-called draw cut that is so famous of the Middle East and Asia as well in general. And this was emulated with straighter swords and with military European swords. But again, you have to do it with your wrist rather than with the actual blade doing the work for you. And the final thing I want to point out is they are actually very, very pointy and slender at the end. They're not like falchions or messers, not even like most tulwars. They, unlike a lot of blades that are, if I just grab this tulwar off the blade, like a kiliç or certain tulwars, which are very broad and sort of fat at the end, or indeed something like the 1796 style blade behind me here, they're not broad at the tip. They're not a hacking tip at all. They're a very slender and light blade. So a very different design. You might think, well, is that for thrusting? I don't really think so, because of the degree of curve, although, as I've talked about in previous videos, you can thrust with very curved blades. You just have to think about the thrusters working differently and coming around or down or up instead of forwards in a straight line. So you certainly could use it for thrusting, but I don't particularly think that that's what Middle Eastern swordsmen were doing in general. And in fact, the sources describing Middle Eastern, North African, and indeed most Asian swordsmanship accentuates that they're all about the cut, and this sword really is specialized for the cut, not so much for the thrust. Not to say it can't thrust, but it is specialized more for the cut in my view. But that being said, I just want to reiterate that these blades actually, particularly these kind of 16th century onwards style Shamshir blades, differ quite a lot to how they're represented in mass media, be it movies or fantasy art, or even sometimes in some historical art, they get the curve wrong. So there you go. Those are the main things I want to point out. They're not very broad. They're more or less straight for the first half of the blade. And finally, they are slender tipped, not broad tipped. I will undoubtedly talk more about this sword. I think it's a very interesting sword. It's a lovely sword in the hand. It's got a very ergonomic grip. You'll notice it's narrow for those languettes to come in there, and then it broadens out to fill the hand. Very, very, as Colonel Mary talks about in his memoir on swords, that style of pommel is very comfortable in the hand and rests against the hand and enables you to really get a lot of leverage into the draw cut. Very, very, like I say, ergonomic and comfortable. Also, the shape of the grip being quite rectangular, particularly at this top end of the grip here, quite flat as well, enables you to index the edge. I mean, you wouldn't have a problem usually with that being a very curved blade, but it enables you to index the edge very, very easily. And of course, the little quillons, the cross guard, assists with that as well. So Overall, a very popular and widespread style of sword, one that I haven't given much exposure on my channel. In fact, I don't think any channel in the world has really given any exposure to this type of sword, but I will hopefully give it a little bit more now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.